ever-evolving soap opera that is, of course, what's happening over at Royal Lodge.
Prince Andrew never really leaves the news, but there's been a sort of tsunami of coverage over the last couple of weeks.
What's happened with Andrew losing his title and now her losing Duchess of York, it just proves that the York brand is totally toxic.
The layers of duplicity and shallowness, this is a new low.
There's a chapter in the Andrew and Sarah Ferguson story that still shocks even those familiar with royal scandals. Not the toe-sucking photographs that made global headlines. Not the public humiliation or the eventual divorce. Something far more audacious that happened inside the marital home itself. In rooms meant to be private, during hours when a husband should have felt secure in his own residence. This involves hidden lovers, reckless behavior under the Queen's roof, private confrontations that left witnesses stunned, and a marriage that was crumbling long before the public saw a single crack. What staff observed, what biographers have documented, and what senior royals desperately tried to contain reveals a level of dysfunction that seemed impossible within the carefully controlled world of the monarchy. The details aren't just shocking, they expose how two people behaved as though consequences simply didn't apply to them, as though royal privilege meant freedom from basic accountability. And the fallout from those choices is still reshaping their lives today. Sarah Ferguson entered the royal family with enthusiasm and what appears to have been genuine affection for Prince Andrew. But what she walked into was fundamentally different from what she'd imagined. Andrew was in the Royal Navy, often deployed for months at extended periods. According to multiple accounts, the couple saw each other for barely 40 days a year during the early period of their marriage. That's less than 6 weeks annually. Hardly enough time to build the emotional foundation a marriage requires. This created an environment where loneliness became Sarah's constant companion. And loneliness, particularly when combined with youth, wealth, and access to social circles filled with charming opportunists, creates vulnerabilities that someone more experienced might have anticipated. Sarah, by all accounts, did not anticipate them. She simply felt increasingly isolated in a marriage that existed more on paper than in daily reality. This is where Steve Wyatt enters the story. Wyatt was a wealthy Texan businessman, smooth, confident, attentive in ways Andrew couldn't be given his naval commitments. They met at a British opera festival in Houston, and according to sources close to Sarah at the time, she became completely captivated. Some authors quote people around her claiming she once described Wyatt as the love of her life. Whether that's literal truth or emotional exaggeration in the moment, the effect on her marriage was unmistakable. Their connection deepened while Andrew remained away on duty, completely unaware of what was developing back home. When he eventually discovered what had happened, the marriage suffered damage it would never recover from. The cracks were no longer private tensions that could be managed discreetly. They became visible in public behavior. Dr. Alan Starkey, who has written extensively about Sarah Ferguson, recounts a telling moment that revealed how icy things had become between them. Leaving a bar in Mayfair, a heavily pregnant Sarah tripped and fell. Andrew continued walking, offering no assistance whatsoever, leaving her to catch up on her own. For a couple who'd been presented as a modern royal love story, it was a startling glimpse into how fractured their relationship had actually become. Wyatt eventually moved on and became engaged to another woman. But the emotional damage his affair with Sarah had caused to the marriage was permanent and irreversible. And yet, astonishingly, this was not the most shocking affair connected to their relationship. What came next crossed lines that left even hardened royal insiders genuinely stunned. Then came John Bryan. Officially, he was positioned as a helpful business advisor, managing commercial aspects of Sarah's books and media ventures. In reality, according to biographers who've interviewed people close to the situation, he was something far more intimate. And from this point forward, the story doesn't just take a troubling turn, it drops into territory that seems almost impossible to believe. Bryan was allegedly staying at Sunninghill Park, the marital home that had been gifted to Andrew and Sarah by the Queen herself. According to Dr. Starkey's research, Andrew was completely unaware that the man supposedly helping Sarah with business matters was involved with her personally and intimately. The arrangement continued under Andrew's own roof without his knowledge. But the most astonishing detail, the one that still generates disbelief even among people familiar with royal scandal, comes next. It's claimed that when Andrew went to bed for the night, Sarah and Brian would slip into Andrew's private study within the family home and engage in intimate behavior, mere steps from where Andrew had been moments earlier. Not in a separate location, not during times Andrew was away, in his own home, in rooms he used daily while he slept upstairs. Lord Charteris, the Queen's former private secretary and a man who'd seen decades of royal crisis management, reportedly reacted with visceral outrage upon learning this detail. His response was said to be simply repeating one word: vulgar, vulgar, vulgar. For someone of his generation and position, the brazenness of conducting an affair inside the marital home, a residence gifted by the monarch, represented a level of disrespect he could barely articulate. Then came the photographs that made all of this public in the most humiliating way possible. The infamous images from the south of France showing what appeared to be Brian sucking Sarah's toes while she lounged topless by a pool. These weren't paparazzi catching a private moment from a distance. They were clear, detailed photographs that left no room for alternative interpretation. The pictures blew the private scandal wide open and left the palace scrambling to contain damage that was already catastrophic. But those images were merely the public eruption of a far deeper problem that had been festering inside the family for years. The palace reaction was severe, and leading the response, according to Andrew Loney's recent biography, was Princess Anne. At a private family dinner, Anne allegedly delivered a ferocious reprimand directly to Sarah. She criticized her judgment, her recklessness, and the profound humiliation she'd caused the entire family. What makes this moment particularly remarkable is that not one person defended Sarah, not Andrew, not a single relative or friend present at that table. She faced the full force of royal disapproval completely alone. One witness recalled that Sarah carried on as though she were the injured party, placing blame on photographers and tabloid editors instead of accepting responsibility for the choices that led to those photographs existing in the first place. Later, she was reportedly summoned before the Queen herself for a private conversation. A staff member quoted in one biography described Sarah's demeanor as strangely defensive, almost indignant, as though she still didn't fully accept that she bore primary responsibility for the scandal. This inability or unwillingness to acknowledge her own role in creating the crisis apparently frustrated senior royals even further. While Sarah's behavior dominated headlines and dinner table conversations across Britain, biographers insist that Andrew's own conduct contributed significantly to the marriage breakdown. One former driver told author Andrew Loney that Andrew had allegedly been involved with more than a dozen different women within the first year of marriage alone. So while Sarah's affairs were splashed across front pages for the world to dissect, Andrew's were discussed quietly behind palace doors and among staff who witnessed his behavior firsthand. Together, these patterns left their marriage with no solid foundation whatsoever. Both were engaging in behavior fundamentally incompatible with maintaining any real partnership. The difference was that Sarah's indiscretions became public spectacle, while Andrew's remained largely hidden from view. In 1992, while Sarah was away from the residence, Andrew telephoned her. According to several accounts, he informed her they were separating. She reportedly burst into tears, genuinely distressed and overwhelmed by the news. But the most interesting detail from that conversation is what Andrew allegedly told her about who was actually making this decision. He said the choice wasn't entirely his own. The palace had reached its limit. Senior figures had lost patience with the ongoing scandals. The marriage had become completely untenable from their perspective, and it was time for a public announcement. They divorced in 1996. But unlike most couples who separate and move on to independent lives, this did not mark any real ending for Andrew and Sarah. Despite the affairs, despite the public humiliation, despite the divorce itself, they continued living together. Royal Lodge became their shared sanctuary, a peculiar arrangement to outsiders, but apparently a familiar and comfortable routine for them. They raised their daughters together in that residence. They took holidays together. They appeared at events together. They even publicly described themselves as the happiest divorced couple in existence. To observers, it never looked like a rekindled romance. It looked more like two people who'd survived a shared catastrophe and were now bound together by whatever experiences, secrets, or simply mutual understanding they'd developed through it all. Some believed they genuinely understood each other better than anyone else could, having both navigated the strange pressures of royal life and public scandal. Others believed more cynically that they remained close because separating fully would risk uncomfortable truths emerging into public view. That maintaining the partnership served both their interests in ways that had nothing to do with affection. Regardless of motivation, they remained together in that shared existence for decades after any romantic relationship had ended. Now, all these years later, that arrangement is finally being dissolved. Andrew has been stripped of his remaining royal privileges, his titles, his public role. He's been ordered to leave Royal Lodge entirely. The residence that housed their strange post-divorce partnership for so long is no longer available to them. Andrew will reportedly move into much smaller accommodation on the King's private Sandringham estate. Sarah's next residence hasn't been confirmed publicly. What is clear is that the long and complicated partnership they maintained for so many years is quietly coming to an end, forced not by personal choice, but by institutional necessity. Their marriage didn't fail because of a single mistake or moment of poor judgment. It failed because of repeated patterns that neither of them seemed capable of breaking or even fully acknowledging. Affairs conducted with shocking recklessness, long absences that prevented any real connection from forming, profound loneliness that created vulnerabilities, complete lack of accountability when confronted with consequences, indulgence in behavior that showed contempt for basic protocols, terrible choices made with apparent assumption that rules simply didn't apply to them. For years, rumors have circulated that Andrew's private behavior was far more reckless than the palace ever publicly admitted. Staff members and former protection officers have spoken quietly, often only after retirement, about a steady stream of women appearing in Andrew's orbit during the height of his social life. Some of these women were said to be escorts rather than social acquaintances or friends. These weren't discreet relationships maintained with any concern for privacy or propriety. They were apparently impulsive encounters that raised serious concerns among those tasked with keeping the royal household functioning securely. According to several accounts, Andrew showed remarkably little interest in the protocols expected of senior royals, particularly regarding vetting procedures, basic discretion, and exercising minimal judgment about who gained access to royal residences. Most alarming are claims that some escorts were brought into Buckingham Palace itself without proper security clearance. Staff would reportedly discover unfamiliar women arriving late in the evening with no explanation and virtually no documentation of who they were or why they'd been granted access. In royal security terms, this represented a serious breach of protocol. These weren't vetted friends of the family or known associates who'd been through background checks. They were complete strangers brought into one of the most sensitive and protected buildings in the country, with no identification, no security screening, and no clear understanding among staff of who they were or what justified their presence. It created ongoing frustration and genuine concern among palace personnel, who had to navigate the security implications, while Andrew apparently carried on, as though standard rules simply didn't apply to him. These patterns of indulgent behavior on both Andrew and Sarah's parts reveal one consistent truth about how they approached their lives. They behaved as though consequences were for other people, people beneath them in status or position. They seemed genuinely surprised when actions had ramifications, when scandals had costs, when the institution finally lost patience. The damage they've left behind extends far beyond their own reputations. It's contributed to broader questioning of royal privilege, of what accountability looks like for people born into extraordinary status, of whether the monarchy can survive when its members treat their positions as permission rather than responsibility. Now, both of them are described by palace insiders as sliding into steep decline. The comfortable life they maintained for decades at Royal Lodge is ending. The titles are gone, the public roles are gone, the protections are gone. They're facing a future that looks nothing like the one they assumed would always be theirs, simply by virtue of who they were born as or who they married. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.